Hello and welcome to Sci-Fi Night Light. This is a different segment of a show where we take a look at some random assorted topics somehow relating to sci-fi or horror. So, despite this being called Sci-Fi Night, as you know, we also cover quite a bit of horror. Why is that? Well, science fiction and horror have a long and healthy relationship that was popularized during the 50s with plenty of films that blurred the line between sci-fi and horror.
Science couldn't explain it. It's most terrifying of the science.
Science has agreed.
Even classic monster movies from the 30s to the 50s like Frankenstein and Creature from the Black Lagoon, as well as tons of other monster films from the periods, include both sci-fi and horror elements to make something that blends together very well.
It's alive!
What about something a little more colorful? Alien is one of the most famous horror films of all time, but it's also one of the most famous sci-fi films. So, which one is it? The film includes plenty of speculative science and biology.
Now we're assuming it's feeding him oxygen. If we remove it, could kill him.
But also tons of horror elements. It's definitely a scary film, even if the scares don't hold up quite as well today as they did during the late 70s. But in the end, it's a film that walks the line between the genres perfectly. John Carpenter's The Thing is another classic example. The film has tons of science elements, but it's also without a doubt a horror film. And a very gory one at that, which is what makes it so awesome. More modern examples include films such as Event Horizon and Pandorum. Both contain a healthy amount of speculative science, enough to justify a sci-fi label.
It creates a dimensional gateway that allows it to jump instantaneously from one point of the universe to another light years away.
But also enough to call it a horror film. In addition, just look at any space horror film ever, basically. Recent yet less successful films such as Apollo 18 and Last Days on Mars are clearly both genres as well, and thus very clearly sci-fi horror. What about other classic movies such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Fly? The latter film is considered a staple of body horror, but the film itself deals with the effects of teleportation.
Human teleportation, molecular decimation, breakdown, and reformation.
While the premise of Invasion of the Body Snatchers certainly is creepy, it's all rooted in science fiction.
It's got no detail, no character. It's unformed.
All of a sudden, they're growing like parasites. Is it contagious? People are being duplicated.
It's hard to justify sci-fi horror as its own genre, though. It's hard not to call Alien and The Thing horror films, but also hard not to add a sci-fi asterisk considering how much of it is involved.
Some crock of shit.
Still though, if we were to introduce a middle genre, then in the end we'd have to create even more subcategories and it would just be an endless spiral. So I guess you can say that sci-fi horror is somewhere between a subgenre and its own genre. Still a unique case. This of course doesn't mean that these two genres are eternally bound together, but they without a doubt have a lot of ties. I'd say a lot of this has to do with the sci-fi horror craze of the 50s, where a lot of the horror had its roots in the fears and mystery of what science could do, as well as the fears of the atomic age and all the radioactive monsters that would inevitably follow.
We're born in that swirling inferno of radioactive dust, where things so horrible.
After all, the biggest fear we have is fear of the unknown. Science fiction entails a certain element of speculation about the unknown. In a way, sci-fi horror is the science of fear, the fear that causes horror. That's why it makes sense that these two genres go so well together. When horror and the unknown are so tightly linked, theories on the unknown make for great setups and thus great sci-fi horror films. So to make a long ramble short, this is why we include so much horror on this channel, because horror and sci-fi have and will continue to have a great and creative relationship. So that about does it for this episode of Sci-Fi Night Light. I'm your host, Sebastian Vettel Martinez, and I'm signing out.